Good morning, friends. Mark Milwee, Trinity, Alabama, Mountain View Baptist Church. If you have your Bible this morning, let me invite you to turn with me to Matthew chapter 12, the Gospel of Matthew chapter 12. And we're going to look at a lesson today that I've entitled Lord of the Sabbath. Lord of the Sabbath. Now, as we move into chapter 12 this morning, I think it's important to go back and review the last few verses of chapter 11. Beginning with verse 28, it says, "Come to me," Jesus says, "Come to me, all who are weak and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you shall find rest for your soul. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Twice in this short passage, Jesus says that we're to come to Him to find rest. The Hebrew word for rest is Sabbath, from which we get our word Sabbath. It means rest or repose. Now, remember, when this passage was first written, there were no chapter breaks. So Jesus goes straight from talking about how to find real genuine rest in Him to showing that there is really no rest to be found in just mere religious observances. In other words, the Pharisees, who Jesus is debating here, thought they were close to God because they were keeping all of these man-made rules. However, Jesus shows us once again that true rest is found in a personal relationship with Him, and He calls Himself the Lord of the Sabbath. So let's dig in and see what we can learn today. Verse 1, chapter 12. "At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to Him, 'Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath.' And He said to them, 'Have you not read what David did when he was hungry and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which it was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priest? Or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. And if you had known what it means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." So the text says that Jesus, He's walking along with His disciples, and it's the Sabbath day, and they're hungry, and they pass through a grain field. So they take some of the grain, and they begin to eat it. Well, the Pharisees complain, not about taking the grain, but about the fact that they're doing this on the Sabbath. So let me point out a few things. First, this was not stealing. The Israelites were commanded in the Old Testament not to harvest their fields all the way to the edges, but to leave some for the poor and hungry. In fact, Deuteronomy 23:25 says, "If you enter your neighbor's grain field, you may pick kernels with your hands, but you must not put a sickle to the standing grain." So this was a common practice in their culture. This is not what caught the attention of the Pharisees. What caught the attention of the Pharisees was that this occurred on the Sabbath. This action was a breach of the law according to their traditions. But Jesus gives three compelling reasons showing that true rest is found in Him. Look at verse 4. "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and how that he and those who were with him entered the house of God, ate the bread of the presence, which it was not lawful to him to eat, nor for those who were, but only for the priests?" So Jesus, of course, here is talking about King David, and this incident is actually recorded in 1 Samuel 21. David was fleeing from King Saul. He went to Elimelech, the priest, and the priest, said, "What are you doing here?" and all that. And David said, "We're on a rapid journey. We need something to eat." And he said, "Well, I don't have any common bread on hand. All I've got is the holy bread. And if your young men have kept themselves from women." And David said, "Truly, the women have been kept from us as always when I go on an expedition." So then they said, "How much more today will their vessels be holy?" So the priest gave him the holy bread, for there was no other bread there, but the bread of the presence, which is removed from before the Lord to be placed by hot bread on the day it is taken away. So Jesus here, what He's doing, He's reminding the Pharisees of this story, this historical event from the life of King David, and implies that if King David could break the law and not be guilty, then it was okay for he and his disciples to do the same. But he doesn't stop there. Next, he appeals to the example of the priest. He says, or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. So here, Jesus is referring to the fact that the priest, they're required to work on the Sabbath, yet this service was not seen as a breach of the law, but as a fulfillment of it. And Jesus says, I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. Well, of course, he's referring to himself. In fact, he makes three greater than statements in this chapter, and this is the first one. This is why the Pharisees object so strongly to what he says in this chapter. He is making himself out to be equal with God. But now look at the third example. He now appeals to the prophets, verse 7. And if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So this is a direct quote from Hosea 6:6, and it must have been one of his favorites because this is the second time in Matthew's gospel that he quotes it. The first time was back in chapter 9, when the Pharisees were complaining to his disciples that he was eating with tax collectors and sinners. And on that occasion, he said, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick, go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. In other words, I came to call sinners unto repentance. Unfortunately, those who were righteous in their own eyes, well, they think they don't need Jesus. Of course, the same thing was happening on this occasion. This is why Jesus says that God is more interested in his followers showing mercy than he is in offering sacrifices. God doesn't just want religious observances. He wants to be a part of our life. He wants our love and our devotion, not our legalism, which brings up a good question. Ask yourself this question. Do I extend the same kind of mercy and forgiveness to others that I extend to myself? You see, we all have the tendency to think that we're doing okay while we point out the shortcomings of everybody else. It's just part of our human nature, but this is the point that Jesus is driving home. Those who are righteous in their own eyes are really not righteous at all, while those who are really righteous are those who are showing mercy to others and depending upon him. Let me offer a couple of examples. First, this is not just about rule keeping. Anybody can keep a rule. For instance, I try not to speed when I drive, not because I love that rule, because I don't want a ticket. But to show mercy would be, I've internalized this enough that I try to do it just because I want to. But that's not a really good example. Let me give you another one. What about our quiet times? We don't have a devotional time just to check a box and say, I've spent my time with the Lord today. We have a quiet time because we want to spend time with the Lord. It all goes back to what motivates us, and this is the heart of what Jesus is getting at in this passage. The Pharisees thought they were, loving and serving God by keeping all these man-made rules. They thought they were defending God's honor, but Jesus says, no, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. He is God in flesh, and he's standing right in front of them. And then he goes on to say, I am Lord of the Sabbath. But instead of falling down and worshiping him, they go out and seek ways to kill him. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Look at verse 9. He went out from there and entered their synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And they asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him? He said to them, which one of you has a sheep, if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not take hold of it and lift it out? Or how much more value is a man than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And the man stretched it out, and it was restored healthy like the other one. But the Pharisees went out and conspired against him how to destroy him. Well, the first encounter in this chapter with the Pharisees happened out near a grain field, but now they're in the synagogue because it's the Sabbath day and that's what they do. So they're in the synagogue and a man comes in. He has a deformed hand. This time they ask Jesus if it's lawful to heal on the Sabbath. They don't ask him this question because they really care about this man with the deformed hand. Instead, they're looking for ways to accuse Jesus. The Bible even says they asked this question that they might accuse him. But instead of answering the question directly, Jesus asked them a question. Verse 11, which of you, if he has a sheep, if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not take hold of it and lift it out? Well, the obvious answer is yes. They would all do that. So therefore, Jesus says, of how much more value is a man than a sheep? So he says it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. So you got to admit they walked right into that one. I mean, Jesus answered their question with a question to which the obvious answer was yes, and then shows them that it is lawful to do good deeds on the Sabbath because, again, God desires mercy over sacrifice. Now, I love this encounter with Jesus not only because it shows his wisdom, but because he used their argument against them. Jesus knew all about human nature, and he knew everything about these Pharisees. He knew they would not hesitate to save the life of one of their sheep if something happened to it. As a general rule, they were greedy people. They would not let an animal from their herd die just to obey a rule. But then Jesus turns the tables on them by saying, well, a man is much more valuable than an animal. Therefore, he says it's lawful to do good deeds on the Sabbath. Again, showing mercy is more important than obeying rules. So he healed the man with the withered hand. And then he said to the man, he says, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out. It was just restored like the other one, healthy just like it. And Jesus didn't just talk about doing good. Jesus did good deeds. He didn't just talk about showing mercy, he showed mercy. I mean, you would think that the Pharisees would be excited about witnessing this miracle where a man with a deformed hand was healed right before their eyes, but their reaction says they were not excited about it at all. In fact, verse 14 again, but the Pharisees went out and conspired how they might destroy him. So why did they have such a violent reaction to all of these events? Well, again, Jesus, first of all, clearly outsmarted them or got the best of them and embarrassed them. They thought they had him in a bind in the grain field. He appealed to the example of their greatest king, their priests, and their prophets. Next, they thought they were going to trick him in the synagogue, but again, he turned the tables on them, made them look foolish. But there's even a deeper reason. Jesus made himself out to be God. We see this verse back up in verse 6, where Jesus says, I tell you something greater than the temple is here. So Jesus, referring to himself, says something greater than the temple. And then, again, I told you earlier, this is the first of the greater than statements in this chapter. The second one's found in verse 41. If you drop down there, the men of Nineveh will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and behold, something greater than Jonah is here. And of course, Jonah was one of the prophets, and in this verse, Jesus is claiming to be greater than the prophets. Now look at verse 42. The queen of the south will rise up at this at judgment with this generation and condemn it, for she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and behold, something greater than Solomon is here. So in the same way, Solomon, one of Israel's greatest kings, Jesus, is claiming to be greater than him. I mean, we would all agree with that. We would say, well, of course, Jesus was greater than all three of these things rolled into one, prophet, priest, and king. But this would have been heresy to these Pharisees. This is why they sought to destroy him. Look at verse 15. Jesus, aware of this, withdrew from there, and many followed him, and he healed them all and ordered them not to make him known. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. Behold, my servant, whom I have chosen, my beloved, with whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he will proclaim justice to the Gentiles. He will not quarrel or cry aloud, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not quench, until he brings justice to victory, and in his name the Gentiles will find hope. So Jesus withdrew because it was not yet his time, and the text says he healed many in fulfillment of this prophecy from Isaiah. This passage is actually the longest quote from Isaiah in the Gospel of Matthew. This actually comes from Isaiah 42, 1-3. This is the first of 4 passages in the book of Isaiah that's known as servant songs, and they're all fulfilled in the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. There are several things I want to point out about this servant song, and we'll be done. First, the servant was chosen by God. Second, the servant is beloved by God and one in whom God is well pleased. God will put his spirit upon this servant. He will proclaim justice to the Gentiles, so his message is for everyone. He will not quarrel or cry aloud. His voice will not be heard in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break. A smoldering wick he will not quench. He will bring justice to victory, and in his name the Gentiles will find hope. In other words, Jesus came for the bruised, the hurting, the outcast, the neglected. He came to give them hope. Jesus Christ is the fulfillment of this prophecy, and we can find hope in him. He is not just a king, he is the King of Kings. He's not just a priest, he is a priest in the order of Melchizedek, what we read in Hebrews. He's the fulfillment of all the Old Testament. And he's not just Lord, he's Lord of the Sabbath. And he will give hope to any person who puts their trust in him. Well, thank you for joining me today. God bless you.